Hello, I'm George Willett with the Westport Christian Church. Thank you for joining us as we continue our verse-by-verse study in the book of Acts. Last week we got into chapter 7, those first about 5 verses. Remember, chapter 7 is a transitional chapter. It's when the story that God tells is changing a little bit. There's a shift that happens after this story. And we read in 6, the problems in the church, the mumbling, the low-level simmering hostility, disunity, because people were upset that our widows aren't getting treated the right way. And so the apostles said, hey, we're gonna solve this. And they appoint these 7 men to help them with the administrative task of taking care of people so they can study and pray and proclaim the word of Jesus. And it was great, and things are going wonderful. The church is growing, and that's what we keep seeing. There's problems in the church. Persecution happens. The apostles handled it in a godly way, and there's rejoicing, victory, and growth. Then there's persecution, and it's handled in a godly way, and there's rejoicing, victory, and growth in the church. And then we start seeing there's problems in the church. There's some hypocrisy, some people who their hearts are untransformed and they want to appear holy without actually being holy. Ananias and Sapphira, they lie and say they've given just like everyone else did, and they gave everything, but they didn't. And God handles that problem, and there's rejoicing and the church grows. And then there's persecution from the Sanhedrin, and it's handled appropriately and the church grows. And then Stephen, this guy who's chosen to administer the ministry. He's evidently doing a great job, and he is out there doing what he needs to do. And through him, God is doing all these miracles, these signs and wonders. He's proclaiming the word of Jesus. And that brings him into conflict with Jewish people, these men of the synagogue of the freedmen. And they're arguing, you're wrong. This is not who Messiah is. This is not the plan of God. And no matter what argument these men have, Stephen in the Spirit can refute it. He can answer it. He continually shuts them down, and nothing they do can overcome the wisdom that he's bringing to them about the Word of God. So in their frustration, they get people to bear false witness, to get false witnesses to lie about him. And he's dragged physically, forcibly before the Sanhedrin. And that's what we get into chapter 7. He's before the Sanhedrin, and he's being asked about it. And they're not looking for justice. They're not looking to do the right thing here. They're just wanting to catch him so they can punish him. They can get rid of him. And he goes into effectively what I'm going to call a sermon. It's this apologetic. He's giving this defense not of himself against these charges, though he addresses some of this. He gives a defense of Jesus, of the gospel. He condemns these men who are supposed to be leaders, who are proclaiming to love God, who are supposed to be bringing people closer to God, who had said they were waiting for the Messiah. When he's done here, he's revealed not just their hypocrisy, but their emptiness. I mean, they're just these empty tombs. Because he talks about Abraham. And he goes all the way back that God was with Abraham before there was a promised land, before there was a promise, before the covenant, before there was a temple. God's presence was with Abraham. And it was counted, he believed in God, he had faith in God, and it was counted as righteousness. That this relationship with God is not about all these external physical things that the leaders had made it. It was about a relationship with God based on faith, trust in who God is. And we get into verse 6 of chapter 7. And Stephen is talking, and he says, but God spoke to this effect, that his descendants, Abraham, would be aliens in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I, God, myself, will judge. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. Stephen here is quoting from the Septuagint. It is a Greek translation of the Old Testament text. And this is the translation that many of the Jewish people in Israel at the time would have been reading. And he goes on, he says, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. And I'm just struck that, I realize God's plan is not always easy or quick. But I've got to remember that God sees all, God knows all, and God has a plan. So he chose a man. He says, I'm going to work out my family, my chosen people through him. And Abraham is like, okay, I believe and I have faith. And he's given this sign, this seal called circumcision. This is a sign of the covenant promise that he had received by faith. It's not that he is counted as righteous because he was circumcised. It's not as he was counted as righteous because of all the obedience that he did. It's counted as righteous that he had faith in God. And you can go look in Romans chapter 4 and read about Paul talking about this. The Jewish people had by this point become very attached to all of this external symbolism and all this external stuff that proved they were holy, that proved they were God's chosen. And the sign that they were given, the seal of God on them as a people, was a promise that's passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to the 12. This is talking about this promise we have as the people of God. And the promise is not based on works. I mean, this should have been obvious to them as Stephen's talking, that he's bringing up faith on purpose. It's not based on our works. It's not based on law. I mean, the law hadn't even been given when the covenant was made. And by bringing this up, again, he's subtly reminding these leaders, the covenant with God predates the law. It predates the temple. So that faith is the basis of a relationship with God, not circumcision, not the temple, not the law, not all the stuff we've added onto it. We're talking about faith. Now that's important as he builds his case as he goes along, because everything he's doing now is going to be preparing him for what he tells them at the end, which he's going to point straight to Jesus. The Sanhedrin, as these leaders, they took pride in all of their compliance. We're righteous, we're holy, because look, we do all the right things, even if our hearts are far away from God. We follow the law. In fact, we've added all this stuff to the law to make sure we don't mess up, that we take pride that we are circumcised. We have more knowledge of the law than anybody, and we keep the temple ordinances. What really had happened is they had come to depend upon their works instead of God. Their faith was in everything they did, not in who God was. This is a brilliant, brilliant story that Stephen is telling. And it's so subtle and it's so wrapped up in their history that it may take them a minute to kind of figure out how to connect all these dots. He's putting this little path of dominoes that he's going to be able to knock down. And he goes on. Acts chapter 7, verse 9. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt, yet God was with him, and rescued him from all of his afflictions, and granted him favor and wisdom and in the sight of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all of his household. Now a famine came over all of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction with it. And our fathers, the patriarchs, could find no food. But when Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob, his father, and all of his relatives to come to him, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and there he and our fathers died. From there they were removed to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So again, think about this. Stephen is using the stories of their history to show them how they've missed out on the story that God is really telling them about Jesus. You see, Joseph is a type of Christ in the Old Testament. His life, his faithfulness, the unfair persecution, the imprisonment, and even his eventual exaltation to the right hand of Pharaoh all foreshadow, they're kind of tell us a little piece of the story of Jesus when he comes. We can see that God was working even back then. And he says the patriarchs. He doesn't call them the fathers at first. The patriarchs on purpose. You got to understand these 12 guys who the nation of Israel is kind of named after, the 12 tribes of Israel. Their identity as a people are so wrapped up in these men. And the patriarchs had become revered. They were beloved. They were wonderful men. And Stephen says, and what is it these wonderful men who followed God did? Out of jealousy, they attacked, imprisoned, planned to kill, but eventually sold into slavery their own brother. Joseph had been chosen by God, but his own people rejected him. Do you see the parallels yet? I'm telling you, there's something that's being done here under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. I love this. But it says, in his affliction, and all of this that happened to Joseph, again, remember, he was the youngest child. He was beloved. He was, his dad's special son. And he had these visions of his brothers bowing down before him. So they were going to kill him. I mean, they beat him up. They tore this cloak off of him. They threw him in a pit. They wanted to kill him. Their other brother talked him out of it, so they sold him into slavery. But God was with him. Joseph endured. He endured the hatred of his family, this rejection by his family, being sold into slavery into the house of Potiphar, this official in Pharaoh's household. He's over the prisons, and he has God with him. He continues to be faithful, so Potiphar's sees that in him. And he rises in Potiphar's house to this position of authority because he's faithful to God. Potiphar's wife takes notice of him. He's attractive. He's young. She tries to entice him into a sexual relationship, and he says, I can't do this. I can't dishonor my God. I can't dishonor your husband. This is not right. And she eventually gets so desperate that she gets him into the room, and she grabs, and this man who wants to escape sin so bad, he runs right out of his cloak. I mean, he spins and goes, and she's left holding his cloak. But she can use this for great evil. She tells her husband, look, your slave, he tried to molest me. He tried to rape me. And I've even got his cloak to prove it. And Potiphar he's got to believe his wife, not the slave. So he throws him in jail. Wow, you think I'm doing the right thing for God, but it seems like my life is getting worse and worse. But in jail, what does Joseph do? He still is with God. He has faith in God. Not that God is going to miraculously take him out of prison. Not that my life will be better just because I love God, but I love God because God is God. And I'm going to still do the next right thing no matter the circumstances in my life. And the head jailer notices. And he rises up. He becomes a trustee of the prison. He's an inmate, but he's got position of authority. He's taking care and administering the care of things. Well, also in jail with him are two servants from the house of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They were sent there, and they both have these horrible dreams. And Joseph, through God, is able to interpret them. Pharaoh's going to reject you and kill you. You are going to be restored back to him. The baker is killed, the cupbearer is restored. And he goes back, and all Joseph says to him is, when you go back to Pharaoh, please don't forget me. Remember what I did. Remember that what God did through me and the goodness of this. And what does this man do? He completely forgets Joseph. But Joseph continues doing the right thing by God. And later, Pharaoh has these horrible visions, these dreams, and no one can interpret them. And at that point, his servant is like, boss, there's this guy in prison. Remember you threw me in prison years ago? And This other guy, he was killed, but I was restored. Well, we had dreams, and there's this guy in your prison that can interpret dreams. Now, Pharaoh's tried everything, and nobody can do this, so he says, go get him. I just need someone to tell me what this all means. And Joseph comes and says, oh, I can't interpret dreams. My God can, and we can trust in him. And so Pharaoh tells him this dream of the 7 fatted cows that are just overly fed, and then the 7 that are coming out and they're starving, and the stalks, and God gives the interpretation. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. There's going to be an abundance more than we could possibly use, and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh's like, well, thanks, and what are we going to do? And Joseph, under the wisdom and discernment of God, during these years, hold back some. The abundance, let's save, let's store, let's get ready so that when the famine comes, we can take care of our people. Because he is this godly man who is doing the right thing regardless of his circumstances, Pharaoh sees that in him and lifts him up. He's rejected, but the king lifts him up and places him at his right hand. He gets this position of authority, this position of power. There's Pharaoh, and then there's Joseph right there. Again, do you see there's parallels? Well, then the famine hits, and his family is starving in Canaan, there's Israel, and Jacob sends his sons down. Not all of his sons. He's got the youngest that's beloved, but he sends his sons down. He says, get food, and they go, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so you can read in Genesis, he does this. He kind of gets it so that he can keep a brother with him to kind of not lose contact. He's like, hey, you guys are trying to take stuff from me. This isn't right. I'm going to keep him. You guys will need to come back and bring your younger brother. Well, they go, and unfortunately the food that they got run out. They got to go back for a second trip. And it's here that Joseph says, it's me, your brother. And his sons, his brothers are overwhelmed. I mean, they know what they did. And eventually there's this time when they fear that he's going to confront them and punish them. And Joseph says this amazing thing. Don't worry about it. What you intended for evil, God used for good. Again, those parallels that Stephen is reminding them of before he tells them the end of the story. Because what is it that Stephen is so aware of? That men intended for evil, but God actually had always intended to use it for something good. That's the cross. That's the sacrifice of Jesus. That no matter how evil that was, and it was evil, no matter the intent of men, the Jewish leaders, the Jewish population, the Romans, I mean, everyone hated Jesus. Everyone seemed to be against him. It really, in the end, was what God used to redeem mankind. Again, this whole story mirrors the story of Jesus in so many ways that he's reminding them of some truth about who God is. Joseph endured faithfully, and he was blessed by God with positions of power and authority. And what did Joseph do with it? He saved his people from death. What did Jesus do with the power and the authority that God had given to him? He saved his people from death. Joseph forgave his brothers who hated him and wanted to kill him, sold him into slavery. He forgave them and saved them too. What does Jesus do with us? He forgives us and saves us too. Stephen makes it clear that the patriarchs had originally opposed God and opposed God's will. They betrayed the chosen one of God, their brother, and that God used their evil act to actually save them. The comparison between the patriarchs and the Sanhedrin is so clear and inescapable. They opposed God and his will. They had an evil act, and God used it to actually offer them salvation. But he goes on, Acts 7:17. But as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. It was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers, so that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. It was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been set outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. Stephen continues to tell their story. He continues to tell the story of God to the point that God is the one who keeps his covenantal promises. Remember, he had promised Abraham that he would give him this land, but Abraham never took possession of it. He promised that Abraham would have more descendants than the stars in the sky, than all the sand on all the beaches of all the earth. But that didn't happen in Abraham's lifetime. You see, God has a timing that is known only to God. But we must trust in his work. We must trust that God will accomplish his will, because we can trust that God will keep his promises. I mean, think about it. Think about it from the mind of a Hebrew person living in Egypt at the time. Let's go back before that. Who would have thought that everything that Joseph suffered was eventually going to lead to such a good thing? How was all that he went through going to be redeemed? Or how all the suffering and the slavery of the Hebrew people over all of those centuries could actually be used for something good? But it was in Egypt that they became a nation. It was in Egypt that they multiplied and grew, and all of these descendants were there. It was in Egypt that they were equipped and prepared. It was in Egypt when they left that they received all of these riches from the people of Egypt just to get out. You can read that in Exodus. You see, and Stephen had been accused of speaking against Moses, but here he shows he knows the story. And the enemies can find no blasphemous words in anything he's saying. And I like this part of the story because I know that there's some of us that are suffering. There are some of us that have hardships. There are some of us that have broken relationships. We have broken bodies. We have lost health. We have lost loved ones. We have lost our finances. We have lost so much. But as believers, we can trust in the promises of God. And we can trust that God can take any evil, any hardship, any problem, and he can redeem and reconcile and make something wonderful. And if he doesn't do that for us here on this earth, we know that in his presence someday, when we go to see him or he comes to claim us, that all things will be made right, that all things will be healed, that all brokenness is undone, that death is done away with, and there's no more tears, and there's no more suffering, and there's no more pain. We can trust in that promise, no matter how long we got to wait for it. But he goes on with the story of Moses that think about the affliction the people were under, that the Pharaoh wanted to kill the little Hebrew baby boys. And that in this, Moses is preserved. He's saved. Not just saved, but he somehow comes through the power of God to be in Pharaoh's own household. But when he was approaching the age of 40, it says in verse 23, it entered his mind, Moses' mind, to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance on the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. But they did not understand. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, Men, you are brethren. Why do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, Who made you ruler and judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you? And at this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. And here we see what Stephen's doing. Now just remember this. Please understand what's being done here. He's revealing Jesus and God's glorious story to the Sanhedrin, and he's doing it with their own history. Because Moses is another type of Christ in the Old Testament. He again foreshadowed so much of the story and who Christ is. Moses came to save his people. He was their deliverer. He was going to deliver them from their bondage, from their slavery, from the hardness of their life and the death that they faced. But even though he delivered them, they didn't acknowledge him. They didn't accept him. They didn't appreciate him. Do you see the parallels? And Moses, what Moses wanted in his heart was he desired reconciliation for his people, for them to come together in peace and in love. But they reject him. They mocked him. They say, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" And this is exactly what we see in the New Testament happening to Jesus. The Sanhedrin, the people of Israel, had failed to acknowledge, accept, or appreciate who Jesus was. That he was their deliverer. That he had come to reconcile them back to God. That they rejected Jesus in his role as Lord and Judge. That he was over them as Messiah. And they should have gone to their knees in worship. They should have accepted his judgment, and they should have appreciated that he was there to deliver them, and instead they had him killed. Again, I hope you see the parallels that Stephen is pulling out here. Stephen is slowly building a case against the Sanhedrin and their own rejection of Jesus. Well, we're going to get there. We got all the way through verse 29, and I hope you see this story. I love this story. Tuesday when I was teaching this, and if you want to get a little bit more animated teaching, if you want to get a little bit more detail, I will say come to the live teaching Tuesday nights here at 7 o'clock at the church. I just can't repeat all of that, what's done here that night, but we do the best we can, and this is the content. But I hope you're excited. I hope you're as in love with the story that God is telling here as I am, and you see what the Holy Spirit is doing through Stephen, and then you understand why at the end there's a reaction that there is. All right, well, God bless. We'll see you next week as we continue this verse-by-verse study.